Good afternoon. For those of you that have already dialed in, the others are going to miss my introduction partly. Welcome to today's webinar on future-proofing transport decision-making by using data and models better. This is the first of a series of webinars that the Transport Planning Society is organizing in preparation for Transport Planning Day, which will be held on the 18th of November. Now, we would never claim that models and data can future-proof transport, but we can certainly use our models and data better to future-proof decision-making, and that is the topic for today. My name is Tom van Buren. I'm the Policy Director for the Transport Planning Society. This is my hobby. My actual employer is Veach Lister Consulting, where I am the Regional Director for UK and Europe, and I also hold an appointment as Visiting Professor at the University of Leeds. I'm going to admit a mistake that I made in the organization of this webinar. I invited originally 4 excellent speakers, experts on the topic, but I made a mistake. I only invited men. So I created a male panel or a manel. And this was pointed out to me, and I'm grateful for Anne and Yasmin for stepping in to ensure that we hear more and more relevant voices, not just adding gender diversity, I must say, but also perhaps a voice from a slightly younger age group than the original speakers I had put together. I get it wrong sometimes, and I'll learn. So on to today's event. First, the reason why, and then the speakers. A few years back, we thought that we were going to have to deal with uncertainty because of technological developments, autonomous vehicles, mobility as a service, and then of course COVID hit, and now the cost of living crisis and climate change is an ever-present threat as well. So basically, a single future and relative certainty that this single future will indeed happen is no longer a defensible basis for transport planning. Some may say that it never was. Future-proof decision-making, we must make better use. We must support this by a different use of data and modeling. And the speakers for today all have very relevant experience in this space of data and modeling. So I expect a fascinating session and an interesting debate, and you as an audience should be part of that. Let me thank Brogan McPherson from PTRC for organizing the event. We got more than 300 registrations, so obviously a great topic, but also a necessity for strong management by PTRC. So thank you. I'm going to run the webinar today as follows. First, each of the 5 speakers will take about 5 minutes each to set out their thoughts on a topic related to today's theme. Then I will guide a half-hour session, a discussion with and between the panel members, and the final half an hour will be over to you, to your questions that you would like to ask the panel. Now, we've got 2 channels as usual for discussion. We've got a chat and we've got a Q&A. So feel free to use the chat to do just that, to chat. But if you would like me to put forward a question to one of our panel members, please put it in the Q&A, and I'll pick those up in about 50 minutes or so. So then the speakers. Today's first speaker should require no introduction. It is Louis or Pilo Willemsen, who is the co-author of that seminal book on transport modeling that you all have on your bookshelves. And it won't surprise you that I have both the first edition and a signed copy of the book. Now, Pilo nowadays is a managing partner in Nomon Solutions and a visiting professor at University College London. Now, some people have said that given the uncertainty about the future, we may just as well dispense with modeling, just rely on data, and this is Pilo's topic for today. The second speaker is Anne Clark from Transport for Greater Manchester. Anne is TFGM's Cycling and Walking Evaluation Officer. Now, I think that TFGM is doing some excellent work in the active mode space, and this should provide learnings for others as well. And we'll be doing her introduction on using diverse data to inform travel infrastructure interventions. More uncertainty, more complex questions. Can we solve this by improving our transport models? The traditional four-stage model that underpins much of how we model strategically in the UK has been criticised by many for being too rigid and focused on motorised traffic rather than the full spectrum of modes, and therefore missing opportunity to promote more sustainable alternatives. So, are activity-based models the way forward? Do we need more or less complexity to future-proof decision-making? This topic will be introduced by Tim Veach, my colleague at VLC. Tim is the Executive Director with technical responsibility across the company, originally based in Brisbane, but recently moved to Madrid. And Tim's presentation title is Activity-Based Models, a Solution or a Distraction? And then in my introduction, I mentioned uncertainty, and in a recent National Highways project on the future of modeling, uncertainty was the highest scoring reason why we need to reconsider if and how we may need to evolve the way in which we deal with data and models. So I'm really pleased and actually a little proud as well that my final two speakers are from Department for Transport and from Transport Scotland, and they will talk about scenario planning. First, Yasmin Fox. She will be talking about how to reflect uncertainty and multiple scenarios in cost-benefit analysis. Yasmin is Head of Scenarios and Uncertainty at DFT, and in June 2022, a few months ago, her paper on the department's common analytical scenarios earned her the Best Paper Award by a young professional at the Transport Practitioners meeting. And then Stephen Craig. Much of what the DFT has published this year is still new to most practitioners, but Transport Scotland has been experimenting with, using and benefiting from scenario planning since I think 2017, and Stephen will probably correct me on that. Stephen is Head of Appraisal and Model Development at Transport Scotland, and he will talk about his practical experience using scenarios. And that's enough from me, so I'll hand over to Pilo.
Thank you, Tom. I will share my screen and change its format very quickly.
That's good.
Yeah. You've seen it in presentation mode? Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Good.
That's the first page.
Yeah, that's right. Well, good morning. As Thomas said, I'm one of the partners of Nomon Solutions and Technologies, apart from my normal practice in transport modeling. So the question is relevant for me because some of the things we do is to generate, excuse me, a lot of data. We are, in fact, today data rich. We have a lot of mobile devices that leave digital traces, digital breadcrumbs, which reflects how we move in our cities. And these mobile phone data and smart cards are the main thing we use at Nomon, but there are also some static sensors, things that, like video cameras that can measure, detect, and provide information about also how people are moving. So the question is, can we now use this abundance of data and actually dispense with models? Is it enough to have probably one order of magnitude more data than we had 5 years ago and move forward without models? What can we do with this abundance of data? Well, the obvious thing is that data is always about the past. Data is never about the future, just by definition of the word data. It's all about the past. It may be a very immediate past, maybe past a couple of seconds ago, in the case of real-time or almost real-time data, but has limitations, obviously. Doesn't tell us a lot about the future. We can use trend extrapolation. We have been using it for many years, but the applications are limited. Machine learning, a branch or an element of artificial intelligence, can deliver better forecasting of some general trends. But again, this is another more sophisticated way of doing trend extrapolation. It may include more influence, for example, when looking at the impact of a change in the public transport fare, may include other influence, for example, by reading Twitter posts, can detect that people are feeling lack of confidence about the future and therefore will be more sensitive to a price increase in public transport than otherwise. But in general, we have very poor, very limited training data sets to get a very useful models based purely on data. And the main reason is that behind all transport problems, there is a problem of space. And space is much more difficult to analyze and estimate using machine learning. We are interested in how the future will change when we change the context, the network, competitive services or new technologies, which is one of the key issues that we're dealing here. So I have to admit that the short answer to this question is that we maybe dispense with models only in a very narrow and very limited set of transport questions. In general, we will still need models. And I'm very happy with that because that's what I do. But we need to use these new data sources in order to make our models better. In my view, and this I presented before, the most significant challenges we are facing is one is in terms of objectives. What is it that we want to achieve? And here I think that the main objective is one of equity between generations, between ourselves now, which are emitting carbon in large quantities, and the effect of that will be paid by future generations, or different groups of people in countries like ours here in the UK, which suffer different levels of inequality. And then we have new technologies that are coming along, and the new technologies offer new supply of services, but also alternatives to traveling, remote working. And all of this is embedded into uncertainty in project modeling and in project appraisal. So how can we use data to make better decisions? This plethora of data can provide information that conventional data collection techniques cannot deliver, or you can deliver it at a much lower cost using big data. They are very useful to monitor changes in travel patterns, in trends, to adapt policy and regulation. The figure on the right is some work we have done monitoring travel in Bogota during the pandemic, before, during, and after the pandemic, for active modes, public transport and cars, using essentially mobile phone data and some additional information on public transport. They use smart cards over there as well. You can also help using big data for the management of traffic systems, for example, in that case, using near real-time data collection. For major capital projects, you have to use this data to deliver better models. They can provide information that data collection cannot deliver. For example, on remote working before and after the pandemic and how this is trending or changing in the future through a better understanding of recurrent and non-recurrent trips, identify travel patterns which are difficult to capture otherwise, delivery vehicles, taxis, for example, have a much wider coverage, monitor early changes in travel patterns to adopt models and more flexible interventions, and something I like very much and is done very little, which is support research based on natural experiments, things that happen, but they were not planned, which change the structure of travel in a city, like could be flooding, could be a strike, and what can you learn from those experiments? As I'm running out of time, I'm just going to flash quickly two examples of this monitoring. This is in Spain, which Noman has been doing during the pandemic to guide government constraints to mobility. And this is some research in Bogota again, which is very interesting because it can show how different sectors, socioeconomic groups of the economy have responded to the pandemic. I finish with these two slides and return the control to Tom.
Thank you, Pilo. And as I said in the beginning, chat please feel free to chat and about things that you find interesting or that sort of raise some questions amongst yourselves, questions to Philo and other speakers via the Q&A channel, please. Anne, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'll just share my screen. Has that come up for people?
Yes.
Great stuff, thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about how we're using a wide range of data to inform our active travel infrastructure development and delivery. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of data in decision making, and then I'm going to be talking about how data is informing active travel decision making in Greater Manchester with a couple of examples. So first of all, with data, it's not just what you've got, but it's how you use it. As the Insight Management Academy said, a good insight badly communicated will sink without trace in a large organisation, but a reasonable insight brilliantly communicated will spread like wildfire. So it's not just what we've got in terms of data and insight, but it's how we're sharing this to inform the decision making that's really important. Thinking a bit further about data versus insight. So data can tell us what's happening, insight can tell us why it's happening and what we should do about it. So insight uses data in context. Data is just observations, but insight adds the so what to this. It uses a wide range of data about people and their lives, beliefs, habits, brings this all together, using different data sources, different methodologies to get a deeper understanding of everything. And insight has the potential to change things. So after we have the so what, we also have the now what. How do we act on this? How do we make sure that we're maximising the value? And that could be using insight to improve a BCR of a scheme, for example. So a few examples of different types of data that we've been using in Greater Manchester. We've jointly appointed an active travel researcher with the University of Salford and done some qualitative research. So something that was done recently, we did some research on active neighbourhoods, also known as low traffic neighbourhoods in other places. A lot of you will know that these have been quite contentious, they've been mentioned quite a lot in the media over the last couple of years. So this bit of research used walk-along interviews with residents in places where an active neighbourhood had been implemented, either as a trial or permanent, or where one was planned, to really understand residents' perspectives and experiences of these active neighbourhoods. And some of the key findings from this, one was that generally people's experiences and views were a lot more nuanced than what the media suggests. So it wasn't this black and white picture that you get when you're reading the newspapers and so on. Also emphasise the need to focus on getting the basics right for walking to really be able to deliver those benefits to all residents. And it also emphasised the importance of having really effective engagement for these schemes to be successful. And the impact of this research has been, there has been a bit of a shift in focus in terms of active neighbourhood design and delivery in Greater Manchester, including the types of interventions that we're looking at, how we engage with people and so on. And this is really important because to make sure that we're delivering effective schemes that meet the needs of local people and meet our strategic objectives, we really do need to really understand how they feel and experience these schemes when they are implemented. A second example that I wanted to talk about is the Cyclops Junction evaluation. The Cyclops Junction is a design that's been developed in Greater Manchester, and it provides segregated provision for cyclists so they can safely travel through junctions. And this is done within the existing rules and regulations within the UK and within a typical footprint that you might find for this type of junction. It is a new innovative design, so it's really important that we understand how it works in practice. It's also a really key part of our planned infrastructure delivery to deliver an active travel network across the region. So we really need to understand how it's working. This is a bit of work that we're partway through. It's made up of several different components. One of the ones that I wanted to talk about today is the Disability Design Reference Group site visit. We've got a Disability Design Reference Group that we engage with in relation to various transport related things in Greater Manchester. We had a site visit to a couple of the Cyclops junctions that have already been delivered to really observe how they experienced using the junction and get some feedback from them. And this was really useful. It's already led to some small changes in the design, nothing really fundamental, but some things that could really easily make a big difference to different user groups, and the kind of thing that you'd never really be able to pick up until you have that real world experience of someone on the ground experiencing it. And this is really important because we really need this type of design to be able to deliver on our kind of safe infrastructure to be able to meet our objectives for active travel. A second element that we have already been working on as well, we've worked with a company that did a drone survey, so flying a drone above the junction and capturing video footage, and then combining this with machine learning techniques to really understand how people are using the junction in terms of where they're traveling, where they are in space, how those interactions are happening. And we've got lots of other activities planned that haven't yet happened for this evaluation piece. And then the third example that I wanted to talk about is called the Greater Manchester Sales Funnel. This is based on a representative sample survey with Greater Manchester residents, and it asks about how they travel, do they use different modes of transport, and how they feel about them. And from this research, we've split people into different segments depending on whether they use the modes of transport and how they feel about it. From rejectors who don't use a mode of transport and don't want to use it at the moment, to champions who already are using mode of transport and would recommend it to other people. And this has been really insightful for active travel because often people lump together walking and cycling, kind of see them as a group that you can treat in the same way. But it really showed to us that actually the way that people feel about and use these modes of transport is really different, and the way we should treat them should also be different. So you can see that for cycling at the moment, we've got a really big chunk of rejectors, we've got quite a lot of not nows as well who aren't using it but aren't necessarily against it. Whereas for walking, it's almost the opposite thing. We've got a lot of champions, a lot of usuals, and not many rejectors at all. So this has been really helpful for informing our overall strategies for walking and cycling in Greater Manchester. So to sum up, it's when data is transformed into insight and communicated well that it's most valuable for informing decision making. And we use a wide range of data to inform active travel decision making in Greater Manchester, which I've mentioned a sample of today. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anne. And a quite different angle on topic, and I'm sure one that will raise some questions and chat. And I myself put a few in the chat to get the ball rolling. Tim, you're next.
Thank you, Tom. Share my screen. All right, can people see that? Brilliant. I'm a little bit croaky today. I've just picked up a cough from my daughter overnight, but we'll give this our best go. So as Tom said, I'm Tim Veach. I work with Tom at Veach Lister Consulting, and I've just moved to Madrid. My topic today is activity-based models and whether they are a solution or a distraction. And hopefully this will move to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Cool. So I'll jump, I guess, straight to my conclusion, and then I'll jump into how I got to that. So I guess my opinion is that activity-based models do offer a better, more future-proof framework for addressing the questions we now face and the potential new questions that we might face into the future, which we don't even know about. So in terms of how I get to this, so I think my first reason is I think probably everybody would agree, it's no longer viable to simply project historical travel patterns forward anymore. So I think traditional models were often designed to to address questions related to infrastructure provision, services, public transport services, as well as growth in population and economic activity. And for a long time, we focused on testing scenarios around those two things, but we held everything else constant, specifically all of the model's behavioral parameters, which reflect people's travel preferences, as well as the set of options, the set of modes that people face and can choose from. Now, I think maybe that was the status quo 5 or 10 years ago. I think we've been going through a transition towards not holding those things constant. And I've been part of many efforts to, I guess, within traditional models, in 4-step models, try to reflect some of these things. But often it's a bit of a kludge. And in my view, it's more natural to model these changes in an ABM. So why is that? So I think the first reason, and there's probably more reasons than just this, but I'll just list out a few. So in the first reason is that in ABMs, the unit of analysis, often people say it's activities, but to me, it's actually households and their members, the people in those households. And so activity-based models start from people, individual people, and they try to model their behavior. And I think this is particularly important because behavior change, travel behavior change will often vary between demographic groups. And also certain policies might be targeted at certain demographic groups. Work from home is a great example. So in traditional models, you can handle this by having demographic segmentation in your model, but having rich segmentation leads, particularly if there's lots, if segments are kind of long combinations of demographic variables, that leads to a bit of an explosion of trip matrices, and that can impact runtime, data storage, and the interpretability of the results. And it also places limits on how much segmentation is possible. Now, I'll skip my second point there. So I think the second main reason why it's more natural in an ABM is that, I guess, as a philosophical approach, ABMs generally aspire to model, as far as possible, a person's entire day, rather than a focus on individual trips or individual tours. And ABMs also aspire to varying extents to model interactions between household members as well. So they're trying to look at the whole picture, not just kind of zoom in on a trip or a tour. So I think this is important. One of the reasons is that, I guess, new technologies, new modes of transport may have different constraints than traditional modes. So a privately owned car, for example, can only be used by one kind of member of the household at a time. Shared AVs might not have, or wouldn't have, a similar constraint. And I think it's also important because behavior change can also have ripple effects beyond a trip or a tour. And I guess work from home is a classic example where if somebody does work from home, it doesn't just remove their commute, it has a ripple effect through their whole day. Now, the third point here is that ABMs generally also have a more detailed treatment of the time dimension, whereas traditional models are pretty limited in that regard. So I think this is important because traditional models, I guess the time periods in traditional models, we've historically focused very much on commuter peaks and off-peak periods. And that may change in the future, particularly with working from home, and we may need more granularity than we have now. Second major reason why I think ABMs are a solution rather than a distraction is the importance of distributional and equity impacts going forward. It's not just about total benefit anymore. I won't dwell any more on that point. I think it's fairly clear. Now, I guess they're all reasons why I think it's a solution, but it's worth, I guess, putting some realism into this as well. And I think it's worth saying that activity-based models are, to some extent, a set of concepts. And there are important differences between different ABM implementations. You've got, there's more than just the two, but two obvious examples are kind of the North American breed of ABMs, things like Activity Sim and the kind of stuff that's coming in ME Agent, which are really a natural extension of traditional models, and they're based on econometric modeling. Then you've got other things like MatSim, which takes a very different approach. And I guess in this vein, it's important to note ABMs still have limitations. They're not a solution to everything. And it's also worth noting that many ABM frameworks, their kind of design was put in place many years ago, and they weren't specifically designed for the kind of questions we're facing today. So often it'll take work to adapt ABMs to do exactly what we want. But nevertheless, despite those challenges, I think it offers a better framework and a more future-proof framework for addressing the kinds of questions we face today. And so at the bottom, I've just said that in the short term, I think it's more realistic for ABMs to be used to complement rather than replace traditional models. And secondly, I think there's an opportunity these days for agencies who want to learn more about ABMs to use a donor model approach, where you take a model from another region and transplant it into your region, and do that really quickly and start playing with that model and learning about it. Because I think one of the barriers to the use of ABMs at the moment is just, I guess, a lack of understanding and experience using them. So I think that can help. And that's all from me.
Excellent, thanks, Tim. Lots of food for thought there, and the chat is starting to warm up. So thank you everybody for starting to participate. Yasmin, you're next.
Yes, I will just share my screen.
All good, all good. Yasmin, for some reason you've gone back onto mute. Can somebody unmute Yasmin? Yeah, hang on, Yasmin. Start again. No.
It looks like, I think that
Yeah.
because I'm doing this online, I might not be able to share slides, but that's fine because I can talk through without sharing slides and be unmuted that way.
Okay.
So
okay.
to say that when I was sharing, it wouldn't let me be unmuted for some reason, I'm not quite sure. So I'm just going to talk to you today about the common analytical scenarios, which are a set of standard common off-the-shelf scenarios that consider national level uncertainties for use in transport business cases, modelling and analysis. Now, here at the Department for Transport, we really encourage the use of uncertainty analysis, as we see that predicting one line, one number, one benefit cost ratio doesn't reflect the range of uncertainty that we're experiencing in today's world and perhaps have been experiencing for a long time. So our response to that is we want to make it as easy as possible for everyone to consider uncertainty, particularly when they're coming to the department with transport business cases. So what we've done is create a set of scenarios, including inputs, assumptions, and model software that will now allow people to consider uncertainty relevant to the scheme or appraisal that they're doing, and really enhance their business case quality by doing all this uncertainty analysis. So we have a set of common analytical scenarios that consider national level uncertainties. We do still consider the fact that local level uncertainties, such as the interaction between one scheme and another scheme being built in a similar period at the same time, that is still important, and we still expect people to consider those local level uncertainties, particularly as the bigger schemes. But we're trying to enable people to consider uncertainty as easily as possible. So the common analytical scenarios are that way of the way people are getting access to uncertainty analysis. I'll quickly go over what the scenarios are, but I have spoken about it in other talks as well. So first off, we have the high and low economy scenarios. These are a set of scenarios that consider population, employment growth and GDP growth, high and low bounds, and they kind of fit within our standard range of what might happen towards the economy. Then we have the regional scenario, which looks at people moving northward from the south of England and the east of England and London, moving northward to regions, and that redistributes population, employment, jobs, households, all that stuff. And we get some kind of regional redistribution within that scenario, although it stays pretty close to the core when it is considered at the national level. We have the behavioural change scenario, which is all about COVID and behavioural change, obviously. So we've got online shopping, flexible working, increased van trips from the increase in home deliveries happening as people switch from going to the high street to buying online. We have the technology scenario, which has a way of simulating self-driving cars and also an uptake of electric vehicles. And finally, we have two decarbonisation scenarios, which consider not only the uptake of electric vehicles and other non-carbon emitting modes of transport, but also the costs and taxation framework around that. So we don't make an assumption over what would happen, but we kind of provide an upper and lower bound, as if we do nothing to recover fuel duty, and if we do something that means that electric vehicles cost the same as petrol and diesel do now. So that's the set of scenarios, but we also have the core scenario, which is not a most likely scenario, not a prediction of the future, but an extrapolation of past trends and a common comparator which uses central projections from other government departments such as the ONS and OBR, and that is our common comparator which we expect all schemes to assess. And then we expect a range of in-depth analysis depending on the scheme's size and impact level. So for all schemes, we expect a qualitative consideration of all the scenarios. So some kind of brainstorming, thinking about, okay, in this scenario, is my scheme going to work as well as it does in another scenario? And then as you increase in impact size and also get further through the business case stages of development, we expect more analysis to be done, moving towards using transport models and running the scenarios through transport models, which we provide all the numbers so that people can do that. And yes, so there is a whole proportionality framework which is available so that we guide people to do the best level of uncertainty analysis whilst not experiencing the costs of too much time, resource, that kind of thing. And I'll pop in the chat after this, but we have published a lot of things to do with the scenarios. We now have the uncertainty toolkit updated, which is available, which has all the scenario narratives, as well as the proportionality framework. And we have the Common Analytical Scenarios data book, which contains all the inputs, assumptions, as well as a scenario grid showing what changes in each scenario. And we're looking to finalize all the publications so that in November this guidance becomes definitive, and we will be expecting business cases that come to the department to have this analysis undertaken. I'm going to stop there, Tom.
Thanks, Yasmin. A lot of material. Thanks for putting that in, that you're going to put these links into this chat. Hopefully people will see it and start using it. Stephen, I was going to make a joke about your amazing moustache. As you can see, I've never managed to grow one myself, but people can see it for themselves. So take it away.
Thank you, Tom. So good afternoon, everyone. Yes, using scenarios and practical experience. So as Tom mentioned, I've been using them since about 2017. But it goes back a little bit further to what I would call my sliding door moment about 7 years ago, when I decided to attend a CIHT event called Futures. And that event set in chain a transformative change in how I think about transport planning. And that is one which is still ongoing. And one aspect of that event was about scenarios. I do not claim that I have fully mastered the use of scenarios, but I do hope that I can help clear some of the fog for you that has plagued me over my time working on this. So in the paradigm of future forecast, there are at least 3 types of scenario. They are similar but different, and it's important that we are clear on which type we want to use depending upon what it is that we are doing. First up here is predictive. This is the type of future scenario that we've been using for decades. It encompasses the do nothing, the do minimum, the core, the do something. If you create variance around these inputs to create high and low forecasts, these are all still in what I would call the predictive category. So don't need to talk much more about them. We're used to them. Next up are the explorative scenarios. These are there to help us understand and work with uncertainty. I found this diagram the most useful way of thinking about this. There are other ways of doing it. The transactional environment, the bit in orange, is the stuff over which we have control. And the contextual environment, the stuff in blue, is the stuff that we don't have control over. Explorative scenarios explore differences in the contextual environment. When you start working in this space, you'll very quickly find that there are things which you will debate long and hard about whether it is in the contextual or the transactional environment, and it will depend a lot upon who your client is. So, for example, a national government body will have control over a lot of factors that, say, a local government hasn't. And even within a local government, the scale of the projects you're working on will lead to different choices about what's in what environment. A local transport strategy will have more factors in the transactional environment compared to, say, an investigation into a road traffic collision problem at a specific junction. In turn, this actually makes it very difficult to develop a common set of scenarios when you're working at a local level, as Jasmine described as well, that you can have the national, but you will have local things. And then the third type of scenario we have are what are called normative scenarios. And as far as I can tell, this is a very, very rare breed in transport. Normative scenarios are where we imagine a future and then think about the ways in which that future could come about. Normative scenarios can be of the desired future type, a vision-led future, but can also include futures that you definitely don't want to happen. This is about thinking about the future and how we're going to get there. Now, a really important point. What it took me a long time to work out was that the mechanics of modeling each of these types of scenario are the same. There's nothing special about any of them in terms of the mechanics of modeling. There's nothing to stop, conceptually, a traditional do minimum forecast future from simultaneously being a predictive scenario, an explorative scenario, and a normative scenario. It is possible that your do minimum is actually the vision of something that you want, or it could be the vision of something you don't want. So it's not what goes into a scenario that makes it one of these types. It's the way in which we use them that is the differentiator. So predictive scenarios are really about giving you numbers, and if you use multiple predictive scenarios, you'll get some ranges. It might be that the nitrogen dioxide levels in 2025 will be between 37 and 42 micrograms per cubic meter, or that the benefits of the scheme will be between £2 and £4 million. However, any good appraisal will have narrative to give flavor to the numbers. I would personally say that you should never have numbers without narrative. The narrative is what, to me, explanatory scenarios provide, and they give the information to decision makers on the risks to the investment being made. Firstly, there is the possibility of going for what we call the least regrets option, and that might be the one you go for. It's not always the best option, but is the option that performs at least adequately in the most futures. However, there is always a little bit of caution to be taken about the least regrets option, and cast your mind back to what I was saying about the contextual environment. Say that you've put land use in the contextual environment because you're working for the transport department. However, you identify that one of the transport options generally isn't particularly good, but is excellent if land use happens in a particular way. Your client in the transport department may have no say over what happens in the planning department, but the decision makers might have the power to at least change or influence that element of what's in the contextual department. So explorative scenarios are also useful when, what was I talking about? Right, apologies. Right, moving on. So explorative scenarios are also useful when you're working at the strategy end of the strategy program, project design, deliver end of a project timeline. And so what we did, we actually used these type of explorative scenarios in the development of our second national transport strategy in Scotland. Then I would say, if you are thinking this way, it's only a small step to then move towards using normative scenarios. My experience to date with normative scenarios has been limited. But when the Scottish Government announced a policy ambition of a 20% reduction in car kilometres by 2030 from a 2019 base, we now have a normative scenario with and without this ambition. And we need these to appraise all the projects that aren't directly responsible for delivery of that policy ambition. I could go on, but I think that's my 5 minutes up by now, Tom, so I will stop there.
Thanks, Steve. And I learned something there. I will use that last slide of yours to sort of keep my thinking straight on scenarios. Very helpful. I will now start the discussion. 1:15, so overrun that slightly. And I've got some questions that I prepared, as a good chair should do. I'm going to start with you, Yasmin, if you manage to unmute yourself. And I think one of the questions really is about proportionality. So how do we ensure that our transport analysis, and particularly in the context of course, multiple scenarios, is conducted to a high enough standard for each project that we do? And some of these projects are very small. Think of a bus lane or a junction improvement. Others are very big, such as HS2. So how do we do that?
Yeah, so it's a difficult question that we had to consider when we were creating the scenarios and also the proportionality framework. And in the uncertainty toolkit, the way we define this problem and the solution to this problem is that the cost of doing the analysis, the uncertainty analysis, shouldn't outweigh the benefits that come from doing the analysis. So, for example, the time and resource and money it takes to run your model however many times, depending on however many scenarios you're doing, shouldn't outweigh the benefits that the decision maker gets from having that information available and when they're considering whether to go ahead with that scheme. So for a bus scheme, it's quite a lot to, let's say, develop even a model that from scratch. A lot of smaller schemes either take bigger models that have already been made or don't even do much modeling themselves. And so for that, we wouldn't expect them to do building a transport model and running it 7 to 10 times. But what we would expect is them to sit down and kind of think qualitatively about the scenarios, which can be backed up with quantitative analysis. That's where our common analytical scenarios data book comes in. You can look and say, well, in the high economy scenario, this is what happens to population. So we've got that many people in our area. What do we think that will have an impact on how many people are using our bus scheme? And then compare that to a low economy scenario where actually we've got a declining population, and what might that change for the bus scheme in that case? But we do expect the bigger schemes to do more analysis because you're spending more money, you have a bigger impact across the country. So we would expect the risk involved of not doing the analysis to be much higher, and therefore the need and benefits of doing the analysis to be greater. So of course, I'm going to plug that we have our proportionality framework in the uncertainty toolkit, but it is a guide, and we're definitely open to suggestions of, if people are unsure about how it applies to their specific scheme, do get in contact.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I think we're all going to learn, and it's a journey rather than an end point. I think your point about sort of support by qualitative analyses takes me to Anne, and I can't remember, Anne, exactly what the quote was that you used about a fantastic story, but poorly told versus a half good story, but excellently told. And but there is something there about using our qualitative information and much better in the way in which we develop and provide information to decision makers. And I think that sort of begs the question. I think we haven't actually mentioned predict and provide, I think, which is surprising for an event such as this, but why not? Do you think the role of data and modeling will change as we move from a predict and provide to a decide and provide approach?
I think so. This is something that I'd be really interested to hear what the other panelists have to say as well. But yeah, I think in general, it kind of mirrors a lot of kind of what people have been talking about today already, in terms of those wider influences and thinking beyond the transport sphere. And we're probably going to have to look maybe to broader data sets than we might have done previously, and also thinking again about how we think about data and when you're thinking about drivers of change, so it is that combination of like looking at what's already happened combined with like getting those expert views from particular fields of like what are the potential pathways that we could be going down in this particular area, and then trying to work out how that could intersect with another area. But yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what everyone else has to say on this one.
If anybody, Stephen, it reminds me of your normative scenarios. Do you want to jump in there? And if others want to jump in as well, please put up your hand so I can get you involved as well.
As I think I've said in the modeling world at one point, which comes first, data appraisal or modeling? And the data we collect is there to feed the models we are building to answer the questions that our appraisal asks. And I think that change from predict and provide, as you say, about normative, has changed the answers that decision makers want answered. I think that to me is the fundamental change that has happened from predict and provide into decide and provide, that it's not seen as a technological engineering question. We're now getting into, well, actually, what does society want and how is society going to interact with transport? And once you start asking questions like that, you then have to decide what kind of society you want, which then results in different types of models, particularly I think around the agent and activity-based models, which then brings in a huge wealth of additional data that we potentially ignored before.
Yasmin, you have something to contribute there.
Yes, so I just wanted to say, I don't think predict and provide and vision and validate or decide and provide are necessarily mutually exclusive. I'll give my reasoning for this, that if you're wanting to, if you have a vision for the world and you want it to go in a particular direction, you also have to predict what is happening currently and what might happen in the future, and then use that to decide what you're going to do to change what would happen if you didn't intervene. So that's my expression of it, that I think there is still a need to predict in certain cases, but that should be combined with the idea of having some kind of vision or making a decision on what you would like to happen. And so that's my kind of contribution, is that I don't think we necessarily need to completely scrap predict and provide. I think there can be uses for both methodologies, and combining them might produce an even better result.
And of course, I think, Stephen, you already said it as well, doesn't mean that our tools are wrong. It's the way in which we use the tools to create these futures and use the information about that, how you either the futures that how they are arrived at, or how you arrive at the futures that you want to get to, that will help decision making. Tim, do we have enough data to estimate these even more complex models than the current 4-stage models?
Well, I think, to me, I guess the data sources you want to estimate these things still are household travel surveys. I don't think that's changed, not changed at a fundamental level. And I think the sample sizes that we often have of household travel surveys are sufficient for this kind of thing. I think there's probably tweaks to those surveys that are needed. I think there needs to be more of a focus on time spent at home and what people are doing at home, whether they're working at home or shopping at home and those kinds of things. I also think there's more room for collecting attitudinal information as part of those surveys rather than just collecting a travel diary. So I think there's ways which they could be improved, I think. But even just a normal household travel survey is a pretty good start for building these models. And
perhaps a bit of context, I think the Australians are used to more and more in-depth household travel surveys and continuous household travel surveys than we see in most places in the UK. So there is that. Which takes me to a question to you, Pilo. Travel diaries, activity diaries, time use diaries. where do you think we need to spend our money, and where do we need to go?
Well, that depends on the models you're trying to develop, obviously. Activity-based models require activity diaries and also time use diaries at the same time. The two are very, very compatible. In fact, the three of them, you can say they are describing the same thing from a different perspective, but they are describing how we spend our time doing something or traveling to do something in different places. And the time use diary is very good at introducing the constraints that you have to do one thing after another, and you cannot do things instantly from one place to another. They're very similar. There can be equivalent. If you collect them well enough, you can produce the three at the same time from the same survey. And it's not that difficult. Going back, just given that I'm talking about these things now, going back to the previous questions, one of the problems we have, or we have very little experience with vision and validate or decide and provide. They all sound very good. But the problem I find in the little experience I have in this matter is that what society wants is also what I say I want, but it's not what I want to do. I do not want to curtail my international travel, although society wants to reduce very significantly the CO2 emissions that we generate by traveling internationally. And this conundrum puts the problem of planning more directly interacting with political discussion, because politicians have to decide whether the vision that we have, which requires people not doing certain things that they would like to do, are actually viable politically. Will they remain in place if they insist on incorporating restrictions that people dislike? I put that on the table.
Yeah, which for me goes back to models needing to incorporate behavior, which is not the same as the behavior of what people want to do, rather than what we would want them to do, either us as modelers, us as transport planners, or them as politicians. I'm going to move on to the questions and answers. I mean, there's a lot of good questions in the chat, but I've only got one set of eyes. So if you have put them in the chat and you'd like me to consider them, I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to ask them all. Please copy and paste them into the chat as well. I'm going to start at the top. That's easiest. So that's to you, Pilo. What are your thoughts on how the ecosystem of transport models could or should change with the abundance of data that is now sort of starting to emerge?
Yeah, that's a very valid question, and it is related to some of the things that we discussed before we were thinking about this workshop. How to distinguish the noise and the signal, which are very important. I think the ecosystem will improve, will enrich is the right word, I think. We will be able to look at more aspects of behavior that we were not able to look at before. For example, this little example that I shown you very quickly in the presentation, that we could track not just how many trips were being undertaken by public transport before, during, and after the pandemic, but who is making these trips? How are they making these trips? And the last slide I shown illustrates very nicely, or rather very dramatically perhaps, how in the case of Bogota, low-income people actually could not change their travel behavior very much during the pandemic, because simply if they didn't go to work or they didn't work, they didn't eat, because that's the only source of income they have, and there was no safety net, significant safety net in Bogota to protect them. So these questions, which are related to the issue of inequality that several of us have mentioned it here, will be, I think, improved consistently. But there is a very difficult task of reducing the noise which surrounds all data collection, and in particular, big data collection, and reducing that noise to get real insights. So to facilitate getting real insights is one of the great tasks. And that is only achieved through experience rather than necessarily through academic papers. You have to learn from experience what type of errors the data comes with and how you can eliminate or at least reduce them. Thanks.
And I think there is probably some space there for machine learning, or as I posted in the chat as well, somebody told me machine teaching, using the computer a bit better and evolving or emerging algorithms that enable us to get that insight faster than previously. By the way, again, if any of the panelists wants to jump in, if you put up your hand, I can see that I can include you into each of these questions. I like this question from Issa Zananiri, and it's one that has exercised me quite a lot as well. And isn't it the case that in estimation we sort of keep the trends the same throughout time? So the parameters that we estimate today are kept the same for future scenarios. What are we going to do about that? Tim, I'm going to direct that at you. If others want to jump in there as well, please put up your hand.
Sure. Well, I guess, yeah, it is true that historically that is what we did. We held our parameters constant and into the future. And largely we still do and will, mostly still continue to do so in the future as well. But I do think, I guess with behavior change being a key thing, that we do need to change some of our parameters when we're forecasting, at least in a scenario testing kind of way. And working from home is, I guess, the classic example where parameters dictating how often people go to work within particular demographic groups and what they substitute that with is something that we can't hold fixed into the future. We don't know how this work from home thing is going to evolve. Will it continue to be as it is now? Will it go back to what it was before? Will it become even more pronounced? Who knows? So, we need to be monitoring that, but from a forecasting perspective, we have to be willing to change parameters, and we need our models to have the right, I guess, levers that allow us to do so elegantly.
Yasmin.
Yeah, so I would just add to that a lot of our parameters, at least in the National Transport Modelling Suite here at the DFT, do change over time, scaled by certain factors like fuel costs changing in line with GDP per capita or GDP in general. But there are some things that you are right that they do stay the same, but that's where some of the scenarios come into play. I think that's what you were talking about as well. So, for example, in our core, which is, the extrapolation of past trends, trip rates stay at the same level. But in the behavioral change scenario, we alter trip rates, extrapolating trends that were implying a decline in certain purposes, such as traveling to work, going to the shops. Instead, people are working from home and online shopping, that kind of thing. So we do extrapolate forward a change in trip rates that declines over time. And we hit a certain point at which we say, that's probably enough. We could, that is an assumption we have to admit. You could continue to extrapolate it until everyone works from home every day. But we do about 20 years of extrapolation and then hold constant. But I guess with any change to the parameters that you're making, there's going to be assumptions about what they change to, or for how long do they alter before we reach a kind of new steady state. So it's very difficult to, although you'd like to have parameters changing in line with what you think will happen, unless you have clear evidence of what's going to happen, it's again just another assumption, which is where scenarios come in, and then you can fiddle with things in different scenarios and have different scenarios with different alterations.
Yeah, and I think that brings me nicely to one of my bugbears is it's all about the assumptions, and the discussion should be about the assumptions that are being made. We should assume we should be able to assume that the models actually calculate what they're meant to calculate. And then you get into the kind of scenarios that Stephen was talking about as well. I'm not stealing your thunder here, am I, Stephen?
No, I was just going to touch on that there are parameters in there that we don't necessarily write out in detail. They're kind of the empirically derived ones that just sit in the back of the model. So obviously Yasmin and Tim talked a lot about the kind of the, I would say, explanatory variables rather than empirical variables. And I think it's the empirical ones where it's always a challenge when we talk about the machine learning as well, and those sorts of problems you can get with machine learning, that you find a false correlation and your model just suddenly kind of has this bizarre false correlation in it that you never ever knew was in there. And you'd not really created any explanatory element for it. And those, if we keep them constant, there is a challenge there. I don't know how we deal with that. I mean, I know there is some work, I think, in the US with the activity of doing the kind of thousands and thousands of runs where you vary all your parameters a little bit and you kind of end up with some kind of meta model. I'm always a bit cautious about those ones because, similar to the machine learning, you maybe don't understand the relationship about how X causes Y. So I think there's a lot of stuff we need to learn in that space yet.
Yeah, and I should be clear, I guess, with my earlier remarks, I was really referring to the kind of parameters in the back of the model as you refer to them, rather than the variables like fuel price and that kind of stuff. So it's the real stuff that kind of defines people's preferences for travel behavior, how often, you know, how far, what times, these kinds of things, for what reasons do people travel, the kind of fundamentals of travel behavior. So I think those are the things that I guess, particularly with changes in technology and the online world, the way in which people use their time and spend their time is changing. So yeah, I think that's something that increasingly we'll have to look at changing going forward. But yeah, it is uncertain. We don't know exactly what those assumptions should be, but equally holding it constant is itself an assumption that we often don't state. So it's there are assumptions to be made either way.
Yes, and I would like those discussions to be held in the open rather than in the back room by the modelists, so that there is a shared ownership of those assumptions, and also then an understanding of what the impacts of those assumptions are, because even that could be helpful to learn from in terms of, you know, how we achieve the kind of policy objectives that were there for the transport intervention, in a sort of a vision and validate kind of thinking process. Pilo, you had something to add here.
Yeah, now that we are discussing assumptions, and this is very critical, in a sense, we use them to look at different scenarios. But my question is a question to Tim more than anything else, or to all of us. Is it easier to discuss assumptions and create scenarios in a conventional aggregate model, or is it simpler or more correct to do in an activity-based model, which is treating individuals with their own individual assumptions?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a universally true answer to that question, but I think in general it will be more elegant to do it in an activity-based model. And I guess an example is the whole work from home thing, where I've seen plenty of efforts to update things like commuting trip rates in conventional models. But in order to do that and to reflect the variations by occupation and, you know, distance from work and all of this kind of stuff, they're effectively having to build a model outside their model to account for all of those things. Whereas within an activity-based model where you've got people with you know, demographic attributes like occupations, I think that's a lot more natural. You can do more within your model rather than having to to do it outside?
I'm going to add something to it as well. I think what is important with all these assumptions is that they allow that they must allow for feedback. So if you assume that, you know, people work from home and therefore there will fewer trips, you can put it in your trip generation model, as it were, and that's it. Nothing else will happen. These trips disappear. Whereas if you would, I think Tim, the work that you've been doing in Brisbane, where you actually put that through assumptions about in a more people-centric, activity-based model, you start seeing that people that are at home or there will be an impact on the activities that they do at home, which in themselves will make trips, or the other way around. If people work less at home, that they will be able to do fewer, well, they will not be able to do as many escort trips as they did before. Or if somebody takes the car away for a commute trip, that car is not available to household members. I think it's that feedback that I find so important in the way in which we build in assumptions into our models and understand that there's a much wider dynamic going on. And this is why our models were originally already quite complex as a 4-stage model full of iterations and feedback. I was going to bring Anne into the picture, because in the end we're getting far too excited about models and not about data. There's a question from David Carignan is, if we provide a wide range of scenarios to politicians, aren't they going to select what they want to do? Is there a point in modeling? And I'm sure in your work you have come across this problem of providing information, potentially alternative amounts or alternatives that could happen, and how do you present that in a way that people are not cherry picking?
Yeah, I do think that the way we frame data and insight is absolutely key. And yeah, I think something that's quite interesting as well is, like, how does this get communicated back to politicians if they're the ultimate decision maker? Often it's not the analysts and the people doing the work on the modelling or whatever that are going to be speaking directly to the politicians. So often you're having to communicate your findings and your insight to, like, a middle person. So you're having to kind of communicate something in a way that it's indirect, but then that person's then going to be the one having that strategic conversation at that political level. Yeah.
Is there in your, I'll put you on the spot here, I do realize that, is there in your view a problem of communicating the kind of multiple scenarios that we've been talking about, and the uncertainty that exists and the assumptions that have been made to get to actually a number or a range of numbers that then get communicated to politicians and decision makers?
I think in general, our sector is quite reliant on these types of tools. It's very technical, and I think communicating that to people who aren't embedded in our area is always going to be a challenge, and how you do kind of get across from your kind of technical speak to, like, making something that's understandable to someone who's not got their head in the transport world constantly.
So there is always that danger, isn't it, that that there will be some cherry picking taking place, and I think that is a real risk. Whether it's actually better than just giving one number, which will always be wrong, is the question.
I was just going to add something, Tom, that it feels to me like it needs to be more of a conversation with the politicians, rather than, you know, here's all the evidence, you know, a giant amount of evidence, go and make a decision. I think it'd be easier if it was a conversation with the politicians where, you know, you're kind of developing it more collaboratively. They're asking questions, they're getting the answers, and it evolves in a direction that, you know, goes where they want it to go to some extent, as the ultimate decision maker.
Yeah, and I think that's what Anne sort of was talking about in the earlier parts of the presentation as well. I think, folks, the most interesting questions are in the chat. So I'm going to check out if there's anything in the chat that I want to pick up. Okay, I'm gonna grab a question that from Alan Robinson. Going to direct it at you, Pilo, first of all. So should we do more proactive data collection from focus groups to understand what people and travelers might do? For example, younger people wanting to go to the office quicker than others, and I think we might have seen that in the response, the initial response to COVID as well. So proactive data collection to understand rather than reactive data collection for the models that we are using or are expecting to use.
Yes, the short answer is yes. And I think focus groups is a technique which is very much used outside the transport field. And we used to use it before devising state preference surveys. And we always find that be very useful as well. But I think Manchester has done some very good research in that field, identifying prototypical characters that would be relevant in terms of transport demand, which is also particularly interesting. And in the sense of large-scale use of big data, there are some sources of data that you can research as well. I mean, Twitter feeds are an interesting one. They tell you they're all biased, inevitable, but they tell you something about what people find it interesting and important at a particular stage, what people are consulting on the internet, which is also recently available. This also gives you an idea of what are the concerns of people, and you can constrain that geographically as well. None of them is perfect. The most interesting and rich one is perhaps a focus group, but those are quite expensive, and you cannot run very many of them. The sample is always small, and you're always dissatisfied with the size of the sample. But yes, more proactive data collection will take you some way to understand how trends are going to change in the future. What is possible? We were caught out by the sudden increase in cycling and rail usage as well, which our models were not able to explain, models that we developed in the past. And perhaps it was because of some lack of understanding of how people were changing their objectives when choosing to cycle or to walk, which were not just transport objectives, were self-value and health benefits, or the ability to work while you were traveling, which again, it was practically ignored in our models 15 years ago.
Yeah. What I think is also an important point, following from what you said, is we sometimes get carried away by all the data that we collect, and all the insights that we collect needs to be fed into our models, whereas the insight itself has got value as well, and might be in addition to the models rather than to be fed into the models, which would be quite restrictive, time consuming, and not as insightful. Yasmin, you have your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to just sing the praises of some of the behavioural surveys that we've been doing in the department, particularly over the COVID pandemic period. So we've been doing this all change survey, which has been tracking people's transport feelings towards transport and different modes of transport over the COVID pandemic. It did, I think, 6 different waves. And as you were just saying there, you can't just take the numbers. So what we did is not only was there surveys which were kind of, yes, no, how often do you do this certain activity, that kind of thing, but they also sat down with subgroups of people and had a conversation about how they were feeling towards certain modes of transport, which provided a real insight into what some of the numbers might mean. For example, we had like a case of a person who had found through working from home and not having to go into the office, that they were able to take the train in instead rather than driving, because they didn't realize that was an option to them. And on the other hand, you had people who saying, I will never take public transport again because I'm too scared. So it was a really good example of behavioural insights that have been captured throughout a period of change. And it wasn't just questions about what you're doing, but it was also had some questions which were looking towards the future, as where do you see your transport behaviour being next year or in 6 months, that kind of thing. So I believe some of that work has been published or will be published soon. So all change if you're interested in looking at that. And I should say that data has been very useful in considering what, you know, are we nearing a new normal, that kind of questioning, and what should we account for as a COVID impact. That data has been very useful.
That's a good point. I'm going to put you all on the spot. Are we anywhere near a new normal, or whatever you want to call it? Yes or no?
I would say things definitely have calmed down in terms of how much variability there is. A new COVID wave, which is resistant to vaccines, would imply that we haven't reached a new normal. But seeing as we haven't had that in over a year, I would say, in terms of, you know, lockdowns, that kind of thing, I would say we're moving towards, I think we are moving towards a new normal now. This is my opinion, not government opinion, I should say. But we are finding that people are returning to the office. Offices are requiring people to return. For example, in government, we have a requirement to attend the office, which is moving towards that. So I would say there's evidence of a new normal, but also everything could change again. And that's where this uncertainty comes in. We've got other things apart from COVID really impacting, such as decarbonisation technology, other behavioural trends, which were maybe extended or accelerated by the pandemic continuing, like online shopping and working from home. So I don't think there's ever quite a steady state, but we are moving towards kind of a new...
Of course there never was, Yasmin. We just convinced ourselves that there was, and it was stable enough to use as a starting point, as a base year for modelling. Yeah, interested in other people's views. Tim, and everybody in the chat, please throw your ideas around. It's all being captured.
Yeah, so I guess I can speak more from the evidence in Australia, and certainly there, the degree to which people are working from home seems to have stabilised somewhat, and I guess that implies that maybe the short run impacts of this are starting to form a new kind of normal. But I can imagine the long run impacts of this might take quite a bit longer to play out, in terms of, I guess, how it affects where people choose to live, where they choose to work, where businesses choose to locate, how much office space they choose to take. Those kinds of impacts, I think, might take a while longer to play out.
Yeah, and of course, all these post-COVID things will start to intermingle, as Yasmin already said, with other things that are happening as well. And so the question was, to some extent, can we start using 2022 as a base year model, or a base year for our models, which I'm sure many people on the call are asking the questions, and yeah, I would like to have input in. Pilo.
I think the answer is yes. We need to use 2022 as a base year for our models. Is better than using 2019 as a better year for our models, because that was never very normal, but is fairly different from what it is now. And I think one of the issues is that the new normal, which I think insofar as anything can be normal, is here with us at the moment. There will still be changes. That's inevitable, as Jasmine is saying. But there is always change, and the sort of changes I would expect in the next few years are similar to what was happening in the past, I think, essentially. So yes, I recommend using 2022 as a base year. Late, perhaps, but 2022.
Well, it's now or never, because the time period for surveys is closing quickly. And I mean, I agree. Until very recently, I would say until about half a year ago, I would have said, let's use 2019 and build the uncertainty that COVID has brought and all the changes in behavior and the issues around public transport funding and so on and so forth. Let's build that into our uncertainties that go into our forecasts. I've changed my mind. I think I see also a lot of stability, not just in the aggregate patterns, but also in the kind of surveys that Jasmine already pointed out, where we're looking at people's behavior. There's a question, by the way, are the slides going to be made available? The recording will be made available, so the slides are there. I don't know what PTRC does in terms of making the slides available. I think, where were you? Simon Statham, you had a question that I wanted to ask and I can't find it back. Apologies. No, sorry, Simon, I can't find it back. Yeah, I have found it back. And it's to you, Yasmin, and perhaps to all the panelists as well. How are DFT expecting promoters to use scenarios to make a final decision? That single de minimis do something had many limitations, but at least it provided a yes or no for decision makers. It's now going to become a maybe.
Yeah, so I would say we are at early days in this stage of work in terms of we've just published, which means it might take up to 6 months for a scheme which has assessed all the scenarios to come to the department for us to make a decision. And in that time, I'm looking to work with our decision makers, upskill in terms of understanding uncertainty analysis. I mean, a lot of it is published in the uncertainty toolkit, but it is an area of work I'm looking towards, because we now have the ability to kind of balance risk across the portfolio. For example, a decision maker may make the decision to balance the schemes or choose a number of schemes which are good across the board in many scenarios, and then a few riskier schemes which are only good in 1 or 2 scenarios, and it will depend on their risk appetite or their policy ambitions, that kind of thing. But we will be looking to support them with this. And another area of work I'm thinking about is resilience. If we do get an indication that we're moving towards a certain scenario, what do we do about it? And how does the department and decision makers respond to that information? So it's an area of work. I know it's not a simple yes or no anymore, but I think that reflects the level of uncertainty that decision makers face. And perhaps before it wasn't as clear to them that when they were saying let's build X, Y, or Z, that actually something could change that means it was no longer a good decision. So
yeah, and that brings me to a nice closing point that and we haven't talked about it. Evaluation and monitoring will be as important or more important than in the past. Pilo, you already mentioned signals and noise. But in a changing world and with uncertainty, evaluation and monitoring will hopefully help us identify whether we are going indeed in the direction that we want to go, or that the world is changing towards a particular one of the scenarios that we have been forecasting towards. I'm going to bring this to a close because it is almost 2 o'clock and these things always overrun. So I'm going to take pride in my management as a chair of this seminar. Let me thank all the speakers. Fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for taking part. And I also want to say thank you to the audience. There are more good questions that I could handle. Apologies for that. I'm going to have a good look at them over a bite to eat after this. So good to see you all. Thanks for taking part, and I hope to see you in one of the next set of TPS seminars that will take place before the 18th. Thank you.
thanks, everyone.
Bye.